Great. Welcome, everyone, for today's feature presentation. Our presenter is Cass Blodgett. He is a former president of the Arizona Native Plant Society Phoenix chapter and a longtime Arizona native plant enthusiast and grower. He lived in the Phoenix area for over 35 years, but now mainly lives in Oregon, trying to learn the natives and how gardening works there. So let's give a big virtual round of applause for Cass, and thank you very much for joining us today. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. And thank you for that virtual round of applause. Actually, the picture that I'm showing here, these are all some of the plants that I've grown, always from seed in my yard. And the reason why I did this is the obvious. Of course, these are all really pretty. But let's see if I can move here. But the other reason why I did that is about 10, 15 or so years ago, even before that, I got very interested in growing lots of native plants, as I'm sure that others here are. And the first thing that I noticed was that then probably more than now, but I think even now it's not too good, which is that the offerings in Phoenix are kind of pathetic. There's just not a lot of a native selection available, and I became dissatisfied with that. There are opportunities here and there with some of the native plant sales that DBG and Boyce Thompson and that has, but even those I found to be a little bit limiting. A number of people here have this go-to answer for native plants. So let's go to Tucson and get native plants, and that's also an answer that I've tried and have gotten some plants there. But Tucson's a drive, and also what I notice in the Tucson nurseries is a lot of the real compelling plants and things that you look at and say, man, that would be great to have in my yard. They're plants that grow in the Chiricahuas or Dragoons or something like that, and those just aren't going to do well in Phoenix for the most part. So Tucson has good plants for the Phoenix area, but they also have a lot that aren't going to do well here. The nurseries here don't carry them, and what they do carry is just a small menu. A lot of people find them messy and unshapely. They don't really see the beauty in them. It could also be and that they don't take to mass production very well. But if you grow your own, you don't need to mass produce. You don't need that kind of success, and you don't need that kind of consistent science. You just need a few to get by. I found that they make good public relations. People walk by my yard and ask questions about what I have going on there. They've never seen them before. I've converted a few people from being at a minimum sort of I don't care about the desert, these plants, it's all just brush to me, to people being genuinely curious about what's growing on the land and starting to feel protective of it. A lot of it just has to do with people literally just not knowing the names of any of the plants. And for most people, if plants don't have names, then they don't exist. Everything's just brush until you name it. And so growing these plants and sharing them with people is a good way to give some of these plants names and thus making them recognizable. And also, one of the really interesting things about this is it's one of the ways that you can, maybe really the best way that you can really study the early life cycle of plants. I hang out with a lot of botany types, including well-trained, accomplished botanists who are experts on a lot of these plants, or experts on really all these plants, but aren't as familiar with what these plants look like as seeds or as seedlings, as newly germinated plants. So it's an interesting way to sort of learn a life cycle of plants that isn't as well known to most people. For example, you can see the two seedlings at the very bottom here. One is a Castella emeryii, a seedling that I think few people ever actually see, and the other is an elephant tree. And who would recognize these for what they are if you haven't seen them before? These particular patterns of cotyledons. And it's cheap. It's a fun hobby. It's a good way, educational way to take up time, and it's very inexpensive. So what do you need to get started? Not much. You can start at the beginner's end of this just with, you know, seeds in the ground, and for that you might focus on annuals. A lot of annuals are easy to get your hands on. It's a good way to test how your ground is working and what your temperament and patience are for these things. For a lot of people, having native plants in your yard, it sounds like a good idea until you do it and you realize that, you know, you don't have the kind of groomed yard that maybe you thought, you know, that maybe you thought you'd continue to have, and also your neighbors won't see a groomed yard the way that they thought they did. So there's it's a good opportunity to see, you know, how things work for you and in your neighborhood. In my case, my neighbors have all grandfathered me in as a plant nut, and so they don't complain. Most of them like it. I'm sure some don't. I'm sure there's people drive by that don't like what they see, but I'm happy with it, and most of my neighbors are. So you can start there, just put seeds in the ground, or you can go all the way up to a small scale operation where you're growing lots of natives. You've got them in your yard year round in pots, and you're sort of trafficking in them with your friends and your neighbors and other people by trading them and giving them away. So most of what we'll talk about is this lower picture here. What do you do to get started on something like this? If you're not already doing it, if you don't already know how to do it. But to start, let's talk about direct sowing. The idea behind direct sowing is that you can put seeds right into your own front yard or backyard and get some pretty plants growing. A lot of people are under the impression that, you know, these are just these wild plants, they just love to grow. They'll do well anywhere. All I need to do is just sort of cast them out in my yard and I'll get plants. And it's true, if you put some seeds in your yard, something's going to happen. But if you really want to get a good display of wildflowers, or if you really want some plants to grow, some perennials that you want to get going in your yard, if you really want that to happen, you need to do a little bit more than just, you know, spread them in the ground. You need to make sure that the seeds have good soil contact and that the roots have a place to go. So most yards are, most yards, I think it's fair to say, are disturbed ground, and they're also usually pretty compacted. And so you need to prepare the soil before you, even if you just want to put some annuals in the ground or a few perennials, the area that you plant in needs to be prepared. And so I like to dig the soil up. At least 8 inches, a foot is good. I generally don't do much in the way of amendments. It sort of depends on your soil. If you've got super minerally soil, some light amendments can help a little bit, but generally native plants don't want compost and lots of organics. That's not what they grow in nature, and so they don't want too much of it in your yard. But if you've got really dead minerally soil, a little bit can help. I recommend for seeds, September is a good month for sowing. October, you can go in through November. But once you get your first winter rain, you sort of squandered your first opportunity to get good germination going. So you want to get them in the ground before the first winter rains come. September's a good time for them. And you need to provide supplemental watering. You know, the idea that you can put seeds in the ground and nature will just take its course, that will happen. Nature will take its course, and nature taking its course in Phoenix a lot of times is nothing happening. Right? More years than not, we really don't get enough rain to get a good display of plants. In many years, we don't get enough rain to even get anything to germinate. So you'll need to give it some supplemental watering. And then when you do these winter annuals, I recommend harvesting your seeds and giving them away, keeping some for next year and giving some others away to sort of spread the hobby around. And remember, when you put seeds in the ground, that you need to mark your areas. There's so many times I've put seeds in the ground and thinking that I'll remember what I put there. But then, nothing happens. That's one of the deals about putting seed in the ground, is just because you put it in the ground doesn't mean anything's going to happen on the season that you put them in the ground. They may sit there for several years waiting for the right conditions. They're wild plants. And so 3 to 5, even 10 years later, I've had plants come up out of my yard and I didn't know, I forgot long ago that I put something there. So mark seeded areas in your yard. And what I use for markers is I just go buy pretty rocks somewhere. I get, polished agates or a little quartz crystal or something like that stands out in the yard, but is also still a natural material, instead of having a tag or something like that sticking up. And that reminds me that something is there. Usually that's enough for me to remember what is there as well. So is it okay if there are any questions after a couple of foils, if we just go ahead and open it up to a question, and then I'll go a few more foils and then we open it up in case there are any questions that people have right now?
Yeah, that's great. And there's one question in the chat already, something that you had mentioned, one of your first slides or comments, and then we even did this earlier in our open time at the beginning of the meeting. So you had kind of mentioned that the Tucson area is where we often recommend people go to get plants if they can't find them here. But you said, the Tucson area has some great plants, but it also has some plants that aren't great for us. So George asked, what's your experience with some Tucson plants that don't do well in Phoenix? And then also, why would that be? Is it the heat or something else?
Well, first of all, Tucson is not Phoenix. It's a different biotic community, really, even though, they have saguaros and palo verdes and all that. It is a different climate pattern there. And there is a different plant community that grows down there than here. Sort of in my mind, I sort of draw a parabola on the bottom of Arizona. If you put the southwest and southeast corner of Arizona and draw a parabola that goes up to Interstate 8 and back down, that, even as close as Interstate 8 is, even that sort of imaginary line, it's a little bit different weather pattern and a little bit different plant community that happens down there. So I did try a couple of plants from Tucson. I think the ones that I got were chiltepines, which, I just would not expect those to do well in Phoenix. Now, just because they failed with me doesn't mean that they're going to fail with you. And I want to make sure that I don't communicate that if something didn't work for me, that it must not work, because that isn't the case at all. But I did have trouble with keeping them alive. I think I had them for about 1.5 years or 2 years, but they weakened noticeably after the first summer, and then I don't think they made it past the second summer. And again, if you're already familiar with the plant because you know it from this area and you find it in the Tucson nursery, then I wouldn't hesitate with it. But if it's a plant that I think I mentioned a few places like the Dragoons or the Chiricahuas or the Santa Ritas or places like that, those just aren't Phoenix. Those are different climates and different rain patterns and different temperatures, and not all the same things are going to grow there. Some of them will, but not all of them will. And so I wouldn't want to put anybody off from grabbing plants in Tucson, but be careful what you pick out from there.
Great answer. Beverly had a question, and I'm going to hold off on that one just because I've seen your slides, and I think it might be something that you might touch upon later on. So we'll get back to the one Beverly asked, but there's another question. Actually, we'll save that one too. It has to do with planting. So there's a couple about planting that have come in, but we'll save those when we get to that portion of the slide. So I think we're good to go.
Okay. So I just gave one slide's worth of attention to direct sowing. I think a lot of it is common sense. The only thing that may not be common sense about it is don't stuff your soil too full of nutrients, and plant at the right time of year, which is generally, September is a good time to target that. And then prepare your soil just like you would for any other plant. Other than that, what happened when I got into this hobby is that I wanted to participate in the hobby year round. I didn't want to just do it in September and then just watch the results. I wanted to be active in this all year round. And so I started planting things in pots and in seed trays and experimenting and got, a few results, but mostly bad results. And so I just started, trial and error learning over the years. And so what I'm going to present for the rest of this is just sort of how I built up just sort of a backyard operation where I wasn't just producing plants for my own needs and my own use. I was actually producing quite a few more than what I could consume on my own, and really for the purpose of giving them away and trying to sort of spread the joy around. What you need to do to go beyond, direct sowing in your yard is you need systems for seeding and for protecting young plants, for making sure they're hydrated, to transplant them and to try and weatherproof them as best as you can, so that they can survive till they are mature enough to be transported and given away and planted in other people's yards, if not your own. So what I learned immediately is that you just can't take dirt from your yard and put those into pots and expect to get seeds to grow. You might get some, but you're not going to get a lot of seeds to grow. And the main reason is because of how compacted that soil is going to be. Somehow the soil in your yard has enough porosity so that it breathes and so that water can flow through it. But once you dig it up and put it into a pot, it deflates and it packs too tightly and it becomes somewhat impervious to water and air. So I got off of that and then immediately started looking at potting soil and things like that. And most of those come with fertilizers and other things in them. So what I did then is I started looking at old copies of Desert Plants. And one of the old copies of Desert Plants has, I forget which one, so I can't cite it to you, but it probably goes back to the 70s, a whole survey of different nurseries and botanical gardens about how they mix up their soils. And so what I decided was I liked a Boyce Thompson Arboretum soil mix. And so I started making my own soil using their recipe. And then it evolved over time until what I have here to show you. And what I do for potting soil or seeding soil, I use this both for my seed beds and for my pots to transplant in, which is 2 parts garden soil, which is just a bag of soil that you get from Home Depot or someplace that is just labeled topsoil or garden soil. It doesn't have anything else in it. I get perlite and I get vermiculite, and I get, as it's optional, but I also get some native soil, some soil that I get from the desert someplace. So I go 2 parts of this garden soil, 1 part each of perlite and vermiculite, and 1 part native soil. The perlite and the vermiculite thing, do you need both? I don't think so. I just thought if they're different materials, and if the plants get anything out of these, then maybe having 2 different kinds of materials would be good. Just a second. I have a little chihuahua that tries to protect us from invaders, so I'm going to let her out. But really the purpose of the perlite and the vermiculite, this is just soil lighteners. This is to create those lost air spaces in soil to make sure that the water flows through it nicely and that it breathes. And the 1 part native soil, that's probably more superstition than any reality, but I've been doing it for a long time, and so I keep doing it. My theory is that maybe it has little bugs and little fungi and things like that that are good for the plants to grow in. In any case, I don't have any science behind this except that once I started doing it, I started getting good results. And so I've just kept doing it, and I really haven't evolved it much past this point, except for when I'm planting, either seeding or planting cactuses, cacti. I take my soil mix and I basically mix it with 50% sand. And that's playground sand is basically what I get from the hardware store, from a nursery or Home Depot. And I find that gives me good results for cactuses.
We do
Yes.
have a question that's come in about the soils. So question is, do you sterilize the native soils prior to blending everything together?
I've read over and over again that that's what you're supposed to do. And I don't do that. For one, I don't know how, except for maybe putting it in my oven, and I don't want to live with that smell. So I don't do that, although that's a good question, because that is what I read you should do. I still have good success doing this. There are problems, and I do lose plants to problems like damping off and things like that. Some more than others, particularly plants that produce very small germinants, very small germinating plants. Often penstemons fall in that category, where I do have a problem with survival rates of these things. Sterilized soil may be an answer to that, but I just don't have a method for doing it outside of my own oven, which I'm not willing to do. Does anybody have a suggestion there? Does anybody know how to do that?
Yeah, anyone, you're free to unmute or write in the chat if you have any experience in how to sterilize other than using your home. The same person who asked the question, George, she says solarization is an option.
Yeah, and that actually brings up a point that I wanted to. So another thing I'll mention is I don't reuse my soil once things have died in either the seed trays or the pots. I don't reuse the soil because I figure whatever's in there might still be in there. But if I was the next evolution in my process was going to be to designate an area in my yard to put this previously used soil in and do just exactly what was mentioned. I figure a good season or two in the Arizona sun ought to work, ought to help, ought to purify the soil. I didn't try it, but if I was there and when I'm there again, that'll be my next little step in my operation is to have a place to put used soil, spread it out, and let the sun purify for me. So I think that's a good suggestion that was just mentioned.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, there's a couple questions. I still gonna hold off on those from earlier about more dealing with planting.
Okay. So one of the things I found is, well, you need a place to put all these plants. You need some garden platforms, and I found that stacking garage shelves work really good for that. They've got holes in them, so the water flows through. They're strong and they're easy and portable to work with. And they just happen to nicely hold. Really, you can get 3 seeding trays in there very nicely. So one stack of those things gives you 2 good sturdy platforms and an extra shelf, so that if you buy 2 sets of those, then you can get 5 planting tables out of these. These things, these things need a good gentle system for watering as well. And these trays work really nicely for a watering system I developed, and I'll show you some plans for that later. You need a way to protect these things in the winter without any protection. Exposed seedlings and potted plants can run into a little bit of trouble. If you get a frost or if it just gets really, really cold, these plants may stop developing. So a plastic wrap, a plastic tarp to go over it to give you a good greenhouse effect. I did some temperature measurements that on a day that's sort of in the 40s down to the low 50s, these plastic tarps, which is just a roll of translucent plastic that you get at the hardware store, will keep the temperature inside a good 20 degrees higher than the outside temperature, even though it's not sealed. It's not truly a greenhouse because the bottom is exposed through the holes in the bottom of the tray. So you do get circulation of cold air in there, but even so, you can keep the temperature a good 20 degrees warmer inside of these things if you use some plastic tarping. And then in the summer, remember, if you're going to germinate plants in the fall and spring or winter and have plants growing to deliver to others or to yourself in the form of potted plants that you can transplant into another location, they're going to be with you through the summer. And so you're going to want to keep them alive in the summer. And the key to that is, one, finding a place in your yard where they'll get at least partial shade. And the second is to protect them from direct sunshine in the summer, because that'll kill these things. These pots, particularly when they get oblique sunshine on them, they'll heat the soil up to the point where they just cook the roots, and you can lose all your plants in one day with a good hot day of exposure to the sun. So landscape fabric makes a good shade for these things. And what I find is, as the summer gets hotter and hotter, I'll put an extra layer of this on, and even up to 3 layers of this on. And I will also wrap this landscape cloth. I may have 1 layer or perhaps 2 layers on top, but I may have 3 layers or more around the sides to essentially just block the sun entirely from getting in from the sides. You need a system for watering these things, and I developed this system that you see here, these fogger frames or water halos or watering rigs. They fit directly into the risers of these garage shelving tables that I use, and they provide a real nice, even and gentle system for watering. The thing you have to be careful with when you're watering in this loose, fluffy soil is that it takes nothing to dislodge the soil and to dislodge the seeds that are in them and carry the seeds away in the overflow. So I developed this system of really gentle watering, and they use foggers, which are similar to misters that you find out in restaurants on hot days, that you have misters blowing mist around. These foggers, which I was able to get at Home Depot, and I think they still have them, are inexpensive and fit into 1/4-inch dripper tubing. And they provide a great way to provide a drip-free, stream-free. It's really just a heavy fog that just falls on top of these plants. And in about 3 to 5 minutes, you can give all your plants a good watering. And I'll go over a plan for how to build this here in just a second. Once you have plants in pots and you don't want to have these fogger frames over your plants anymore, you just want loose pots or pots sitting on top of these tables without these fogger frames, then I constructed this wand where the key piece of it is this bubbler at the end of it. And anyone that's lived in Arizona long enough knows that lawns used to be irrigated through flood irrigation, where these bubblers would be dotting landscapes, and when the water got turned on, water just flowed out of these things and basically just flooded a Bermuda grass lawn with water. These things are still available, and what I find they are really useful for is they provide a great way to produce a large volume of water that's very diffuse. It has no currents and it has no streams. And so again, it won't dislodge the seeds and it won't dislodge your soil. It won't dig into this loose soil. So it's a good It's a good way to deliver, hand water your pots. If this is being recorded, then someone can go back later if you want to reproduce this, and you can do a screenshot of this picture here, which is the exact plans for these water frames with measurements. It uses PVC pipes, and it uses all materials that are readily available at a hardware store or at Home Depot. Not necessarily a big fan of Home Depot, but they have the stuff you need. So all this is available and easy to find and fairly cheap. So I'm not going to explain the details of this, but I'm hanging on it for a second so that if this gets recorded and someone wants to go back and get a screenshot of this, you can do that and get the measurements. So for seed beds, so now we're talking about actual planting and no longer just talking about the equipment that you need. What I like to do is use these peat pots. These are little tiny, like 2 ounce, I suppose, 3 ounce peat pots that are readily available everywhere. I use them because they're a good way to keep the plants separated from each other. They remain sturdy even after being saturated for weeks or even months at a time. They remain saturated. That allows you to handle these things without them disintegrating on you. So I found that these are a good system for seed beds. I use the rectangular plastic seed trays. Again, these things that are readily available at any hardware store. A lot of times these come with peat pellets or some other kind of blown plastic insert for planting your plants. I've never used the peat pellets and I've never been interested in trying them. Maybe someone has experience with that and find that they work, but I've never been curious about using them. I did used to use the blown plastic little cells that come with these things. And those are fine for germinating plants in, except what I found is that number one, the cells are often too small to allow a plant to have a chance to grow a good root system before they start growing out the holes in the bottom. And then I found that I couldn't extricate the plant from these cells once the roots started growing through those holes. What wound up happening is the roots were breaking off, and that's particularly bad for these native plants. It's really important when you transplant a native plant to really keep the root system as undisturbed as possible, because they really get shocky. So what I do is I just fill these little 2 ounce, 3 ounce peat pots with soil, and these trays hold exactly 40 of these things, 4 by 8 rows of these things. And then it's these trays filled with these peat pots that I put on the table. I put a top coat on these peat pots of little rocks. What you see here are the actual landscape rocks, which those aren't the best thing, but they work in a pinch. I'll buy a bag of 1/4 inch, pea gravel or rounded river gravel for this purpose. But what's good about putting the rocks in there is that they sort of push down on the seeds and make sure that they have good soil contact. And they also break up any flow of water. If there is a stream of water hitting these things, it'll break that flow up and again prevent the soil from getting dug up. And they also help preserve the soil moisture inside of these. These little pots are small, and so they dry up quickly. And so the rocks on top help preserve the soil moisture. Let's see. So, and don't forget to label. I've made that mistake again too. Label your plants so that you know what you have. Also, with these seed trays are really just for holding the peat pots. And so I water into these trays. And so you got to poke a bunch of holes in these to let the water run through. I've also found that these come with little plastic dome lids, and those I found are actually pretty effective ways to produce little greenhouses for these trays as your seeds are germinating. I don't keep them on there forever, but they turn out to be the most effective little greenhouses for these seedlings to germinate in, and to grow these seedlings until they have a couple of whorls of mature leaves on them. They because they do, if you leave them open, because these greenhouses, even with the plastic covers on them, they really just aren't great climate control. There's no substitute for an actual real greenhouse with climate control. These domed lids keep the humidity higher and keep the plants from drying out. So then you get germination, hopefully, and if you put quite a few seeds, you're very likely to get some results from that. The interesting part of this starts, which is that you get to see what these plants look like when they germinate, and oftentimes you'll find that the cotyledons look very different than the mature leaves, the adult leaves of the plants, and you'll often also find that the cotyledons of a given plant family, or at least a given genus, are often really similar. In fact, sometimes nearly identical. If you plant seeds, any of the seeds that are in the Mirabilis genus, and quite a few of the seeds that are in the Nyctej, or in the 4 o'clock, I should say, the 4 o'clock family, they all look the same, no matter what the plant is. The seedlings come up looking the same, and even though the adult leaves look different. What I'm showing here in this middle picture is a plant that is not a very common plant, but it does grow here and there. In fact, it is fairly common on South Mountain, but not common generally. It's Achlyanthes longiflora. I think it has the common name of desert trumpet, but there are other plants that have that common name too. And here on the left, you see the cotyledons from that very same plant. And if you plant any other Mirabilis, it'll look exactly the same. And then on the right here, I'm showing an elephant tree. And anyone that's familiar with Bursera microphylla has seen these adult leaves before, these little pinnately compound leaves. Fewer people see these cotyledons on the bottom, these two palmately lobed cotyledons. So this is one of the really interesting things about doing this is getting familiar with what these look like as germinated plants. And one of the things I noticed, and I probably would have missed out on this had I not been involved in this in growing elephant trees, is I think it was in 2017, we had this very unusual summer season when we had this really abundant monsoon followed by this early winter rains, big rains in October, that brought out unusually it germinated some of the spring annuals out in the wild. One of the other things that it did is it caused nearly every elephant tree seed in the ground to germinate all at once. I've never seen this before, but as I was hiking around South Mountain, where they have a lot of elephant trees, I was noting just about everywhere I went that there were elephant tree seedlings everywhere. Most of them died because those seedlings weren't in the right place for them to grow into mature plants. But had I not been involved in this hobby, I probably would have not recognized that these seedlings were growing everywhere, and realizing that was an interesting year for elephant trees. Once these seedlings have a few whorls of adult leaves, or if you see the roots starting to grow through the peat pots, then it's time to think about transplanting them. And what I do for that is, dump out the rocks that are in these little peat pots. And the peat pots are made to just be planted into the soil or into another transplanting pot as is. But what I find what you need to do is tear away this lip, right? The soil line is below the lip of this peat pot. And it's helpful to tear away the lip of this peat pot until it's below the soil line. Being careful to try not to tear it away down to where you're ripping away any roots that might be growing through the peat pot, and then plant the whole peat pot into a a transplanting pot. And I usually graduated these seedlings from these peat pots into anywhere from 1 pint to 1 quart sized pots for them to continue growing. And even though I don't show it here, it's a good idea, again, to top coat these with a layer of rocks, again, to help prevent erosion when you water these things, as well as preserving soil moisture. Sometimes, when I plant in these peat pots, you see here's another elephant tree in a peat pot here. Usually with plants like this, I'll put 5 seeds in one of these peat pots. And, I hope that I'll get 1 out of each one at least. Sometimes I get 2, and sometimes I might get 4 plants germinating in one of these peat pots. And then I've got a dilemma, because I really don't want to transplant 4 plants into a pot. I want to separate these out. One of the drawbacks of these peat pots is that once the roots start growing through the pots, which they will generally start doing, then they get hard to separate. But I will still attempt to separate these things, and I'll just do it as carefully as I can, separating the plants and allowing pieces of the peat pot to remain attached to roots that have started to grow through them. If I've got 4 plants growing in one of these peat pots, then I'll just divide it into 2, and then I'll pot 2 plants into each of 2 pots. Trying to break it down further just breaks up too many roots and stresses the plant out too much. And I find that I have a lot of losses that way. I'll have losses in transplanting anyway, but the less you can do to disturb the root system, the better off they're going to be. And when you can just transplant the whole peat pot without doing any disturbance, that works out the best. Let's see. When you water these, now when you transplant these into pots, what I found the best way to do the watering is to fill a bucket with water, so that when you submerge pots into the water line will fill right up to the soil line of the transplant pots. There's 2 reasons to do that. One is it's the best way to give it a good watering. The soil, you never know for sure whether or not you might have some dry spots in the soil, or if you just pour water, if you just water these with a hose or one of these watering wands that I described earlier, whether or not that water is actually flowing through the soil column of this pot, or whether it's actually just going down the sides around the soil and out the bottom of the holes, because the soil is dry and hydrophobic. So one of the answers to that is when I water these pots for the first time, I submerge them up to the soil line in water, so that the soil has a chance to get completely saturated, right? And then I gently lift these pots up out of that water, and that has a nice effect of sort of compacting the soil right around this plant. So it's better than pressing. It sort of naturally presses the soil down around this newly transplanted plant to a real nice to what I think is the optimal level for that to have good contact with the transplanted plant. And then I'll usually, if I want to give these plants away, I like to get them to grow into a 1/2 gallon to 1 gallon pot, so that I have a nice big plant to present to somebody when I give them away. And it's also a better way to have a more robust plant to plant into your garden. You can, these 1 quart and 1 pint plants, you can transplant those directly into your yard, but again, you'll have some losses doing that. I find that these larger plants that have been transplanted into larger pots and have had a chance to grow in to these larger pots are going to be more successful when they transplant into a yard. So transplanting these, you run the risk of disturbing the root systems when you transplant them. So that's an argument for transplanting directly into these larger pots from your seed trays. But I find that in each stage of this, I have some losses, and rather than having seedlings being lost in these larger pots that I've now just put a whole bunch of my soil into, um, I like to try to get them to grow into smaller pots where I'm using fewer resources. And then if I have die off, then you know, I have less waste. But the argument could be made that if I just, you know, transplanted directly into these larger pots, then maybe I'd have a better survival rate into larger pots. And that may be true, but I've been, you know, just sort of fallen into this habit of going from seedlings and seed trays to 1 pint to 1 quart pots, and then from there to half gallon to 1 gallon pots. And again, watering these things for the first time, I do it the same way. I submerge these up to the soil line to make sure that the soil is completely saturated.
We do have a question that just came in about a different kind of pot. So the question is, how about tube pots? Do you recommend using tube pots for native plants to form a taproot system?
I didn't understand what kind of pot you're talking about.
Yeah, I think sometimes some plants like milkweed or I think mesquites need like a really tall but very narrow.
Long pot, yeah. No, I haven't tried that. I understand what you're talking about now. No, I haven't tried that. I'm trying to think of if I've grown Asclepias subulatus very successfully and easily in these with this method. I haven't done milkweeds in general. I know there are other plants that like to, like to grow a deep root, and no, I haven't done that.
Okay, so maybe not necessary, or just depends on.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's not necessary. I'm saying that I don't think many of the plants that I've been working with really need that.
Okay. And then also a question where you mentioned the submerging. Submerge for how long?
Just until you see the surface of the soil get moistened from the bottom up, then that's good enough. Then you might let it sit there for just a minute and make sure, you know, if you're seeing bubbles come up, because you've got the water line is right now at the soil line of the pot. And so if there are air pockets in there, you're going to see bubbles emerge at the surface of that water. And you want to make and you want to make sure that those have died down and you don't see those bubbles anymore. And then it's time to pull those out. So submerge until you see the surface get wet, and then leave it submerged and verify that you're not seeing bubbles. And then finally, try anything that works. I was frustrated in that I had really bad luck with anything in the mallow family with the seed trays. A few other species too, but notably the mallows. Try to plant globe mallow or desert hibiscus or what you see here, Horsefortia, Newberry eye. Could not get these to germinate in my seed trays, and the few that I did, they just didn't last. A trained horticultural person probably has an answer to that. They probably know what was going on if they could see what I was doing. I don't have that background. So what I did try is I went ahead and designated a part of my backyard to be a place where I would try to grow seeds that I was then, if they germinated, I was then going to transplant into pots. And I found that seeds that didn't respond to this controlled environment of the nursery, they just needed some wild conditions. Some of them germinate better in the ground. And then when they have a few whorls of leaves on them, I have found that I could then transplant them into pots. And then I could continue growing them into pots and graduate them into these 1 gallon pots that I could then, again, either put them where I wanted in my yard, or I could give them away to somebody so that they could put them where they wanted in the yard. So I found that my method for mallows in particular was plant the seeds in the yard, transplant them into pots, and then I could have a little production line of mallows going. my experiment here, or my demonstration here on the left, is Hibiscus denudata. Both of these plants were seeded at the same time. The one on the left in a seed tray was one of the few that actually germinated. The one on the right was seeded in the ground, and they both were transplanted into pots at the same time. And the difference is pretty significant. What you see on the right are Horsefordia newberryii, again, that I transplanted from the ground into these pots. I did suffer some losses, but I did end up with about a dozen Horsefordia newberryii, and so that turned out to be something that works. Probably not what you would want to do as a nursery, doing a high volume operation, but for me trying to get something growing in my yard, and for me trying to even go beyond that and have a little operation that could deliver plants to friends and other appreciators, this was one thing that worked. So that is the next thing I'm going to talk about, is sort of seed saving and things like that. So this might be a good time to take care of any questions that have to do with the planting part of things.
Yeah, so the first one that had come in, so both you and I mentioned in this meeting today that spring is not an ideal time to be planting things in the Phoenix area, and so someone asked if they do buy plants at a spring plant sale, could they keep them indoors to plant them in the fall? And if the answer is no, do you have a recommendation, or would it be best just to wait to buy them?
I've never tried to keep any of these indoors, but what I have done with these plants, and so I'm guessing it might work with some of the ones you buy at the plant sales, is what I mentioned before, is if you can just make sure they get enough shade in the summer, and you make sure they stay hydrated in the summer, I would expect them to survive. I have good success bringing these plants all the way through the summer in pots, so long as I pay attention to those two things: keep them hydrated and keep them from getting too hot.
Okay, but bringing them indoors, would that be a recommendation, or do they kind of need those?
I just don't know.
Mhm.
I really don't.
Okay.
I have a bad feeling about it, but I just don't know.
Yeah, I kind of think
done that.
it might be a little shocking when they finally do go back outdoors, but that's just pure speculation.
Mhm.
All right, and then the other question, so someone commented that they were going to have free mulch or wood chip service dump loaded at their house, and then spread about 6 inches or more throughout their yard in Ahwatukee. The soil mainly consists of large pebbles and rocks on the side of the mountain. Would that mulch be good for native plants?
That's also a question I don't think I have. I don't have a knowledge-based answer like I have experience with it. The thing that we have to worry about with the native plants is mold. You don't want to create an environment where the soil directly on the plant, directly around the plant, gets moldy, and that might happen with the bark mulch. What I would do with the bark mulch, the bark mulch may actually, at least if you don't use too much of it, might actually be a decent soil amendment for planting in. But as a top coat, I would recommend rocks over bark mulch in the desert.
Okay, great. And those were the only planting related questions. Yeah, so you're welcome to continue.
So, so seed saving, because we were talking about native plants, I'll talk about some sources for seeds. But one of the things you're probably going to be doing, especially if you want to continue, benefiting from the success you've had, is saving seeds. When it comes to that, the thing to understand is that if you're going to harvest seeds from your yard, or seeds from the wild from that matter, it's real important to do it at the right time. And the right time is when these plants are naturally dispersing anyway. If you try and collect seeds before these plants are already beginning to disperse seeds, you're probably taking them too early, and the seeds are in these fruits are probably underdeveloped, and they're probably still dependent on the vascular system that they're still attached to and are still benefiting from. So the key is to wait until these plants are already dispersing, and just what to look for is the fruit should be brown. Most of these desert plants are, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, these plants are going to have sort of dry fruits that turn sort of straw brown or light brown when they ripen and are beginning to open up. And so look for them to be that color, or look for evidence that the seed capsules are starting to open up on their own, or look for evidence in the case I'm showing here, California poppies. Look for the same on lupines. These are plants whose fruits disperse explosively. The capsules blow up and they throw seeds all over the place. So just look for signs that some of these are starting to do that. And then look for only those fruits that look like they're ready for that they're already brown. Another clue is if you try and separate a fruit from a plant, it should fall off very easy. It shouldn't take any effort to pull a fruit off of a plant if it's ready to disperse. So the fruits on the bottom, these are fruits from Delphinium, and these fruits don't readily drop off the plant, but you do see that they open up at the top, and so you can tell that these are ready to disperse, and so these seeds are ready to collect. Once you collect these seeds, then you just want to, assuming you're out in the field or someplace else, you want to make sure that they're being stored in a place where they're not going to, where the conditions are not going to be humid, because you're going to want these seeds to dry out. So, one mistake I made collecting on a roadside one time while I was on a road trip was putting the seeds in a plastic container, a plastic bag, and thinking, well, I'll put these I'll find a place for these later, but for now, just so I can get them, I'll put them in this plastic bag, and then I'll, move them to a paper bag or something like that later. Well, I forgot about them, and when I did remember them and got them, they were all moldy, and it was a lost cause. So seeds don't like moisture. In fact, seeds are trying to actually adjust their hydration to match the ambient humidity, and they need to do that in order to be stable and able to be stored for a long period of time. They also need to do that really before you put them in the ground or try to use them in your seeding operations. So if you're collecting whole fruits, let the fruits dry out in a sack. If you're collecting seeds without the fruits, let the seeds sort of come to equilibrium in some open containers. And then make sure that you label what you collect, because seeds start to look alike after a while, especially if they're ones that are new to you and not familiar with. Indicate the species, the location you got them from, and the date, so that you know how old they are, so that you have this information to give to somebody else if you do some seed trading. After you've collected the seeds and cleaned them, and seed cleaning is a thing you can do or not do, it's your choice. I always meticulously clean my seeds. That has to do more with mental illness than it does any actual need to do that. I just did it because I couldn't help myself. But once you've done that, leave the seeds in an open container and let them sit for about 3 or so months. Right, that's part of that after ripening process of letting the seeds come to equilibrium with their environment. There's some other things that happen in seeds when you let them sit for a while, simulating some of the things that would happen in nature when they are sitting on the soil surface or just under the soil surface for a season before they're ready to germinate when the conditions are right. So the picture I show here, I just have a drawer in my kitchen, and I just keep the little Dixie cups of seeds that I've collected. And then you want to keep yourself organized, and so I use these little hardware doodad trays to store seeds in. If I have a lot of seeds, I use plastic containers, and I just said don't use plastic, but this is one of the only things that are available, easily available for storage, but I keep the lids just barely on. So these bottles that you see on top of these trays, they're actually pretty much open and they're breathing. I've also stored seeds, as you see here, again, not doing what I say, in plastic bags. The reason why I stored them in these plastic bags is so I can see visually, but I always make sure that I got to slip of paper through the opening of the bag to make sure that the bag can't close. And this has worked for me for years. It's worked good enough for years. So I've kept on doing this. So then we have the question of where to get seed, and there's lots of conversation that can be had about this, and a lot of the conversation you can have about this is sort of ethically oriented. I've tried to stay away from some of that because I really don't know, what advice I should personally give on that subject. But there are, retail sources for seeds, and you can see the Arizona Native Plant website, Native Plant Society website, for some information on that. I'm hoping that we'll develop some good seeding trading networks among Native Plant Society. I traded seeds with one or two folks over the years, but we didn't have really much of a trading network going on. Maybe that'll get started. Most of the seed that I collected, I didn't collect in the wild. I collected from my own yard. Once I got things going, I just continued to harvest seed from it and use it for future generations or to give it away. On the ethical part of this, where can you grab seed outside of your own property? I think the legal answer for that is pretty much nowhere, because somebody owns everything or is responsible for everything. So you don't really have the right to take things from any place without a permit. But I do collect seeds from, roadsides or brown lots or places that are slated for development. I don't have any qualms about that. I guess my theory is if you can park your car on top of these plants, then I should be able to collect seed from them. I know that the BLM has a recreational use provision. So if you're on BLM land, you can take, small, little envelope-sized collections of plants, which you can do, I believe, without a permit. I double-checked this last night on the web, so I think I'm still right about this. But not national forest land, and certainly not national parks or state parks or anything like that. You're not allowed to take anything from those, period. And don't take whole plants, and don't take bulbs or corms or anything like that. You're robbing the plant from when you take seeds, you're already robbing a plant from an opportunity, at least partially, to reproduce. If you take the bulb or the whole plant, then you're robbing it from its entire purpose for being, which is to reproduce. And of course, with permits or with permission from a land manager, you can, but you need to make sure you get that if you're on private land or on national forests or national parks and things like that. So I think that is the talk, and all I was going to do is just show a few pictures of some things. What I find I've had lots of success with, I live on South Mountain, and I found that I've had pretty good success with plants that grow around there. Desert hibiscus and wolfberries. These, you can find seeds for these on brown lots, not necessarily on roadsides, but I found these in areas that were slated for development. And I am still growing desert hibiscus from seeds from that are descendants of seeds I originally collected 20 years ago from an area that was now has houses sitting on top of it. The elephant trees, I did collect those from the wild, a thimble full of seeds, and I've been growing elephant trees now for 20 years from that first sample, and so the only seeds I collect now are from my yard. And elephant trees are one of those things that I wish were in more readily available in the trades. They're really, really easy to grow. And I gave a ton of these seeds to the Native Plant Society. So maybe a bunch of people will get a sample of those and start doing this yourself. Other Sonoran and upland natives, Trixus, one of those plants, I don't understand why it's not in the trades. It's a beautiful shrub. The one you're looking at here is one that I grew from seed and graduated through those 2 pot process. And now I've got it planted in my yard. It's now a large shrub, a waist-high shrub that produces a big old cloud of nice yellow flowers. Genusia gracilis, you might not think of that as a good landscape plant, but I have this growing again from seed through pots and then transplanted into my yard. It's now a vine growing up through my elephant trees. It's about 15 feet tall now. Scarlet 4 o'clock. This is one of those things where you learn a lesson. I thought I would have a lot of beautiful scarlet 4 o'clock flowers, but it turns out in the yard, this plant is almost entirely cleistogamous. That is, what you're looking at in this bottom right-hand picture are scarlet 4 o'clock flowers. And these are the full-blown flowers, but it turns out they're cleistogamous. They're fertile and they're fertilizing right now as we speak, but they're doing that inside the sepals, all still enclosed in this flower that has undeveloped petals, but fully developed reproductive parts. These produce seeds, and they produce seeds that will germinate and form new plants. But for reasons I don't understand, in my yard, they are cleistogamous. They don't flower. The picture of the flower that you see here is after 5 generations of scarlet 4 o'clocks, the only case of a flower I ever got. And then a lesson for labeling here in this 2/3 gallon pot is a plant whose I think I finally, after a year, have a suspicion of what this might be. But because I didn't label and because I was away for months and this plant grew up from seedling to a plant with mature leaves on it, I never saw it developing and I never saw it growing, and I lost track of what it was. But I do have a feeling that this plant here is Castella emeryii. It'll take some time to figure out if that's true, but this is what I suspect this might be, and I'll learn more about it as it continues to grow. Angel trumpet, I talked about that earlier. This is why this is such a fascinating plant. You can see this flower on the lower left-hand side. It's a 6-inch long corolla tube that's just spaghetti thin until it bells out at the very top. Desert hackberries are easy to grow and make nice landscape plants. Desert zinnia, these are seeds I got from a seed packet and started growing. This plant turned out not to be a very good survivor in my yard and not very easy to grow in my operation, but other people may have success with it. Western spiderwort was not easy to grow in pots, but the plant that you're looking at here did grow in a pot. I delivered this plant to the Cane Ranch at the Grand Canyon Trust in their garden, and last I saw it was still growing there. Desert rose mallow. I've got these seeds from a plant that I harvested seeds from that I bought and have been growing it ever since. Desert cotton, I don't remember what the origin of these seeds are. I think I got them on a roadside plant, but it did really well in this operation. And I've been able to grow northern Arizona natives. So Arizona thistle, western wallflower, Palmer's penstemon, scarlet gilead, all these things you're not going to get these to grow in Phoenix. You're not going to get these to survive a summer in Phoenix. But I was able to grow them from seed, and just before it got hot, I transported them to the Flagstaff area and gave them away there. And this Palmer's penstemon is another one that was delivered to Cane Ranch on the Grand Canyon Trust property, and last I saw was still growing there. So that's it. Any other questions?
Fantastic. Yeah, there is a question. do you put chicken wire out for new transplant?
Yeah, my backyard is loaded with chicken wire. It's cages. I cut chicken wire into big squares and I make these sort of hoods out of them. I need to do that for any really young seedling in the yard. I don't have to do it for 1 gallon plants or even 1 pint plants. But if because where I live, I've got lots of rabbits around. There's nothing, there's no better gourmet meal for a rabbit than your wildflower garden. So if I'm growing wildflowers and I really want to make sure I see at least some of them develop, I put cages over some of them. So yeah, a chicken wire if you have a problem with rabbits are essential.
Okay, good to know. And so I am going ahead and stop the recording now, but and we are at 5:42, so we're after our kind of set time. But if you're willing to stick around and a few people still have questions, we can leave this open for a little bit more. But I will stop the recording now.
Lisa,